One of the biggest struggles I had early on as a teacher was getting my students to think about what they're reading, that whole comprehension piece. And I remember one of the first times that I deliberately taught them this idea of, reading voice and thinking voice, and how reading is a social act and you need to be interacting with the text the entire time you're reading it. There are things that are happening, thoughts that are forming in your head when you read the text. And I remember the first time I modeled that for my students, because about halfway through, after I had been stopping and questioning the text and stopping and making predictions and making connections between the characters and the characters in another book, I'll never forget the look on Jonathan's face. He raised his hand. "Mrs. Strobel." "Yes, Jonathan." "I'm not having those kind of thoughts." "I know, Jonathan. Many of my students weren't having those kinds of thoughts." That's why I learned I had to intentionally model day after day how to have thoughts about their reading. I had kids who would read 9-10 pages and never have thought once about what they were reading. In this workshop, I teach you the comprehension strategies, but more than that, I teach you how to chunk those strategies so that our kids can get small little chunks that scaffold and build one on top of the other. When I look back to even teaching my kids how to summarize, I would teach them how to summarize an entire chapter when, shoot, they couldn't even summarize a paragraph or 2 sentences. But it was when I began to learn how to execute these mini lessons with students that gave it to them in short little bursts that allowed them to start simple and build upon each one of those, that I really started to see the thinking levels in my classroom change. Even my struggling students began to learn how to think about their text. And so what I've done is kind of created a year-long reading strategy scaffold or plan, so to speak, that will enable you to teach kids how to think critically about text, how to have deep, very thoughtful conversations about text, all the while comprehending both fiction and nonfiction and what they're reading. And I also teach you how to chunk that. What's the first lesson I use when I teach summarization? What do I do a few days after that? When I spiral back around to that, again, 4, 5, 6 weeks later, what's the next step that I do to extend that thinking? And so in this workshop, you leave with the first couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks actually, planned of your reading strategy instruction. But then I give you lessons all year long to build upon those foundational pieces. And what ends up happening pretty quickly is you all of a sudden have a classroom full of students who know how to think deeply about the text they're reading, and that results in comprehension.